Welcome to the Rime Buddhist Center's Dharma Talk podcast, Achieving Peace Through Compassion. This podcast is a recording of the Dharma Talks given during our Sunday service. This talk was given by Lama Matthew Palden Gocha.
I want to tell you about a moment that many of you may recognize. So last week, nothing dramatic, but I had a family member call me, someone who I love very much and who is not here in the Kansas City area. And by the end of the conversation, I had promised to fix a problem for them that I realized I really couldn't fix, especially being so far away. I tried to offer some reassurance that I wasn't really sure I believed, again, because I'm not there with them. And then when I hung up the phone, I was feeling both deeply caring for my family member, but also completely hollowed out, being so far away, they don't have any other family members in the area. And so it's just heartbreaking sometimes when you just can't be there. It can't be a 30-minute drive to get to them. But it's that gap between loving someone and knowing what to do with that love is where most of us actually live. Maybe that sounds familiar to you, where you've had a situation where you really truly care for somebody, but you just don't know what to do for them. We walk around carrying a quiet, unspoken tension, almost a guilt. At least for me, it almost felt like a guilt. On one side, right, there's that analytical part of us, the part that manages our budgets, solves problems at work, tries to understand the world. But then there's the other side of us. Is the feeling part of us, that part that gets hurt, feels lonely, worries about people we love, and looks at the news and our heart aches. We spend tremendous energy trying to balance these two things as if they're opposing forces. Again, maybe this sounds familiar. Maybe it doesn't. Because I think if I get too emotional, right, I lose my clarity. I get kind of overwhelmed. If I get too analytical, I become really cold and detached. And sometimes, and it's very often the case, we then burn out from trying to care for everyone. How many people have felt like they've had a little bit of burnout this year? Compassion fatigue. Yeah, thank you, Fanny. It's omnipresent sometimes. Sometimes we also like to retreat into our numbness just to survive the week. How many people have ever had that feeling, right? Like, as soon as Friday gets here, everything will be okay. We bring our tired bodies, our worries, our distracted minds onto the cushion, hoping for the Dharma to give us some kind of tool to fix this split. Most of the time, we fall asleep, and it's okay. But the Dharma invites us to look at the tension itself. What if this split between kind of this analytical mind and this caring mind really is just an illusion? What if wisdom and compassion were never meant to be two separate things, but are simply two expressions of that same awakened heart? In our ordinary experience, we see the world made up of separate pieces, right? There's the me here and the world out there, my happiness and your happiness, my problems and your problems. The Buddha's earliest teaching is what we talk about in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. And it invites us to investigate these assumptions clearly. The Buddha pointed to what he called the 5 skandhas, the 5 aggregates of experience: form, sensation, perception, mental formation, and then consciousness. These 5 things are like pillars holding up this concept of self. And when we look carefully at any of these moments of experience, we discover something really surprising. What we call the self, this dog tag conglomeration, really is not a fixed, solid thing. It's a flowing process. Are you the same person you were in high school? God, I hope not. At least I hope not. My God, that was awful. So it is this flowing process. It's this changing stream of causes and conditions, each arising in dependence on others. And yet we continually grab at parts of that stream and declare, this is me. We identify with our bodies. We identify with our emotions, our opinions, those stories that we've created in our head. A pleasant feeling arises and we cling to it. An unpleasant feeling arises and we try to push it away. We try to resist it. A perception appears and we treat it as reality itself. And the Buddha's invitation is simple. Look closer. When we use wisdom or prajna to examine our experience, we do not find a solid, independent self standing apart from everything else. We find relationships. We find interdependence. And we find openness. And this is what Mahayana Buddhism calls shunyata. Often translated as emptiness. Terrible English translation because it means much more than empty. And it doesn't mean that nothing exists, like a voidness or a nihilistic view, but nothing exists independently. Everything arises through causes and conditions. Everything is connected, like waves upon an ocean, like the moon reflected in 1,000 different ponds. And the Buddha described this in an early teaching to a wanderer named Kachana. And in the Kachana Gota Sutra, which is found in the Samutaya Nikaya of the Pali Canon, Kachana had asked the Buddha about the nature of right view. And the Buddha's answer was essentially this, that most people are caught between two extremes, the view that things permanently exist and the view that things do not exist at all. And dependent origination is the middle way between those two extremes, that things arise and things pass. But they do not arise or pass as isolated, independent entities as we normally think of. They arise in relationship. They pass in relationship, and there is no self standing outside of that web, nothing to be found. And I think it's important that this is where analytical meditation can come into play, because a lot of times we have an experience when we are just about in our daily life that there is a solid me, right? Somebody threatens us and we feel very solid. Yet when we're on the cushion and we do analytical meditation and we think, oh, that was very solid, and we bring up that experience, but then we start to look at it and it gets all wibbly wobbly, right? The edges aren't so sharp anymore. You know, it's interesting because when we think about this dependent origination of things rising and things pass, but you know, the thing about this teaching that the Buddha wants us to notice is when the illusion of separation begins to dissolve, even slightly, even for a moment, something remarkable happens. Compassion arises. Not because we decided to be compassionate, but because we saw the truth. Wisdom is simply the heart that knows that we're not separate. And when that heart knows that we're not separate, it naturally opens. So sometimes people hear teachings on emptiness and they assume it leads to a detachment, right? Maybe an emotional distance, a kind of philosophical remove from the mess of human life, sometimes spiritual bypassing. But consider the Buddha's own life. After his realization deepened underneath the Bodhi tree, did he become less compassionate? That's a question for the class. No, of course not. What about, did he withdraw from humanity? No. Yeah, the opposite happened. For 45 years, he devoted himself to others. The more clearly he saw reality, the more freely compassion flowed from him. And so real wisdom does not create distance. It removes the illusion of distance. Think about what actually happens when you recognize yourself in someone else's suffering. Maybe you see an elderly person struggling to carry groceries. Maybe you see someone sitting alone in a hospital waiting room. Maybe you see a child crying. Okay, maybe there's a little distance there. No, I'm just kidding. But something shifts, not because you decided to care, but because in that moment, the story of me and them is loosened, just enough for you to feel the shared ground underneath you. Compassion is what the heart does when it sees clearly. As we see in Vimalakirti's illness used as an allegory, for those of you who remember chapter 4 of when we studied the teachings on Vimalakirti, Vimalakirti said to Manjushri, the sick bodhisattva should tell himself, just as my sickness is unreal and non-existent, so is the sickness of all living beings are unreal and non-existent. Through such consideration, he arouses the great compassion towards all living beings without falling into sentimental compassion, but instead arouses great compassion towards all living beings through striving to eliminate the incidental afflictions. So this isn't like a moral command. It's just a description of reality. When we see things as they are, interdependent, relational, empty of the separation we imagine, the natural response is to move towards others rather than away from them. There's another sutra I want to quote, the Samadhi Raja Sutra, often translated as the King of Samadhi Sutra. It's one of the great Mahayana texts, and it puts it in a single verse. They who know the peace that is the nature of phenomena know that sentient beings are suffering. They always beat the drum of the elixir. They will before long become a guide. And so that moment from knowing the peaceful nature of phenomena directly into knowing that beings suffer really is the whole arc of this teaching in 4 lines. Wisdom and compassion are not 2 separate achievements. They are one seeing turned into 2 directions at once. So at the same time, the heart alone without the clarity of wisdom isn't enough. Let me describe someone. You may recognize this person. They're a caregiver, maybe a child caring for an aging parent, but they love fiercely. They give everything. They rearrange their whole life around this person's need. And then they are exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix because the exhaustion isn't physical. If the exhaustion of believing that they worry enough, that they try hard enough, that they carry enough responsibility, they can keep suffering from happiness. But their compassion is real. It's not a thing that's wrong with their love, but something's missing. And what's missing is the wisdom that every being has their own karma, their own path, their own journey. And this wisdom that knows I can be fully present with this person's suffering without believing that I'm personally responsible for ending it, or I can care without carrying the universe on my shoulders. Without wisdom, compassion becomes a form of control, a subtle, loving, exhausting attempt to manage outcomes that we cannot control. Without wisdom, compassion burns out, compassion fatigue. Yongey Kachab Rinpoche puts it plainly in his book, Heart Advice. He says, compassion is very deep and stable. It does not have expectations or agendas. Think about that. How often are we compassionate, yet we're compassionate with an agenda? But this is what we're aiming for, not the kind of compassion that needs another person to get better so that we can feel relief, but something steadier, less conditioned than that. And that's why Rinpoche, following Chandakirti's introduction to the mental way, describes wisdom and compassion as 2 wings, right? A very common metaphor. And he writes, just as a bird needs 2 wings to fly across the ocean to the far shore, we need the 2 wings of the relative and ultimate to cross the ocean of samsara to the state of enlightenment, end quote. And so you cannot fly with just 1 wing. Okay, maybe you can, but you're going to be going around in circles. And Rinpoche goes further. He speaks from his own practice, and he says, in my own experience, meditation on emptiness by itself fails to give the mind the necessary power and confidence to remain in that state if we lack compassion and bodhicitta, end quote. Wisdom without compassion stalls. It becomes clear-eyed but cold, technically correct but humanly useless. And so together they carry us. Together they are sustainable. And this brings to a beautiful teaching. But what does it actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon when you're tired and running late? Okay, let's say a Wednesday afternoon, so that way you're coming here to the Rime Center and you're running late. Let's use a simple example. Imagine a coworker or a classmate for the youngers, right? Imagine they snap at you during a meeting. Immediately, the machinery of the self goes into work. Our body tightens, maybe our chest constricts, maybe our shoulders get really tight, right? Painful sensations arise. Perception then labels this person as rude and unfair, and not only as temporary, but this is the way they always were. Mental formations generate anger or resentment, and before you know it, you have spent the rest of the day replaying that conversation, trying to win that argument that happened 3 hours ago. So without wisdom, we react from inside of the story. We defend ourselves, we strike back, or we swallow it and carry it home and ruminate on it and let it really harden in our heart. But wisdom allows us to simply pause, even slightly, in that moment of tightening. We notice what's happening. We feel the sensations of the body. We recognize the emotions as weather moving through, arising, presenting itself, and then passing. And then we remember this person is also living with stress, fear, hopes, and disappointments. There are causes and conditions behind that snapping voice that maybe I can't even see. The story then becomes larger than that moment. And because the story becomes larger, something in us softens. Compassion emerges, not because we approve of the behavior, not because we become passive, but because wisdom made room for it. Again, Rinpoche often reminds us world peace begins in our own minds, not as a slogan, but as a description of how change actually moves from the moment of recognition outward into relationship, outward into community, outward into the world. And this is where the union of wisdom and compassion becomes real, not in a monastery or a philosophy book, but in conversations, in traffic, maybe even in the kitchen at the end of a long day. So let's try something together. I just want you to set everything aside for a moment, even the time, and just take a gentle breath, letting the body settle. And then bring to mind someone you love easily. Maybe it's a child, perhaps a parent, a close friend, a teacher, someone whose face, when it appears in your mind, causes your chest to soften just slightly. And now hold this question. What does this person most want? They want to be happy. They want to be safe. They want to love and be loved. They want to be free from suffering. And now let that awareness expand without straining, without trying, just gently widening the circle, maybe to every person in this room, knowing that they want exactly the same thing. Everybody in this room wants happiness. Everybody in this room wants safety, freedom from suffering, different stories, different circumstances, different beliefs, but underneath it all, the same fundamental longing. And now try to expand it out even further. Every person in Kansas City. Expand it out further. Every person on this planet. All right, enough of that. Wisdom sees the truth. And what arises in response to seeing it, that warmth, that opening, that quiet wish for others to be well, that is compassion. It doesn't have to be manufactured. It's already here, waiting beneath the stories that we tell about separation. And that's exactly what the Buddha described in the Metta Sutra, right? The very famous discourse on loving kindness. Just as a mother would protect her only child with her own life, even so let one cultivate a boundless love towards all beings. Notice what the Buddha says here. He does not say manufacture this feeling. He says cultivate it. Cultivate it the way Donna's cultivated the garden, the plants out there. Donna's like, no. But when we cultivate a garden, we are removing what blocks the light. We're giving it water and nutrients, but we're not forcing the flowers or the plants to grow. We're allowing them to grow at their own speed. The mother's love for her own child is always present. It's always there. It's the practice is learning to expand it to others. So this week, I'd like to offer a simple practice for those moments when irritation, anxiety, or judgment arises. When you notice the tightening in the body and the mind, just pause. Locate the sensation. Where is it? Maybe it's in the jaw, the chest, the stomach. And don't try to fix it or explain it. Just feel it as temporary waves moving through awareness. Then ask yourself one question. What am I not seeing here? Not as criticism for yourself, not as an effort to talk yourself out of the feelings, just as a genuine inquiry. What's the larger story here? What causes and conditions might be in play that I can't see? And let wisdom make a little room. Then breathe kindly into that room for yourself first, then for whoever else is in that picture. And that's the practice. Small enough to do a dozen times a day, because you probably have to do it a dozen times a day, but enough to change over time how our heart meets the world. So we began this morning with that phone call last week in that familiar gap between loving someone and knowing what to do with that love. And the teaching I want to leave you with is this: that gap is not a failure. It's an invitation. It's where practice actually lives. Wisdom, compassion are not two achievements where we're supposed to hold in balance. They are two expressions of the same nature, a nature that is already present, already whole, already here underneath the noise of the stories that we tell about ourselves with separation. And when the heart truly knows, it naturally loves. And when the mind truly loves, it begins to know. I hope that this talk has been beneficial to you. This week, may you have compassion, wisdom, gratefulness, and joy.
Thank you for listening to the Rime Buddhist Center's Dharma Talk podcast. Music was provided by Barefoot Bran Music. Please consider supporting the Rime Buddhist Center by making a donation at our website at www.rimecenter.org/donate.